Earlier this year until where we are now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, using Russia's nuclear arsenal as a shield to commit violence and to invade a country. I think that really changed the calculus of how the Biden administration saw its NPR.
That's the voice of Jessica Sleight, partner at Global Zero. She's one of today's guests on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, great to see you. How was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. Happy Halloween. My weekend was a lot of fun, but of course, I'm looking forward to trick-or-treating tonight with my younger cousins. And I'm also looking forward to Press the Button Live that we're hosting in about 2 weeks. So stay tuned for that. But Tom, how was your weekend?
It was great, thanks. I'm also looking forward to Press the Button Live. If people haven't checked it out, please do. It was a nice, quiet weekend. It was nice because I was at the Carnegie conference here in Washington Thursday and Friday, which was a great conference, but my first sort of full-bore conference like that in about 3 years. So it was nice to have some downtime over the weekend. Although now I'm worried about the trick-or-treaters and Halloween because it's supposed to rain. Anyway, for people in the DC metro area, I hope the rain avoids us.
Well, that'll at least make a nice setting for those who stay home to watch movies, because that is another fun thing to do on Halloween. But Tom, what do you have for us on the nuclear front for this week?
So the big news is last week, the Biden administration released its long-awaited nuclear posture review, better known as the NPR, after a delay of about 7 months. The timing is notable because the NPR comes in the middle of a war involving nuclear threats and 2 weeks before the midterm elections. And as we know, presidents tend not to make bold changes to nuclear policy at such times, and this case is no exception. President Biden's NPR, I think listeners will find, is a disappointing status quo document. It breaks little new ground and it fails to respond to the moment. Reading it, you almost might forget that the world is facing the most serious nuclear threat since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. But we will have more on this later in the episode, so please stay tuned. In Ukraine, Russia is still accusing Ukraine of preparing to use a dirty bomb against Russian troops, which Western leaders see as a possible ploy to justify the use of Russian nuclear weapons against Ukraine. The West says the accusation is baseless, and the UN's nuclear watchdog is preparing to send a team to Ukraine to investigate. And we'll have more on this later in the episode. Russia continues to attack Ukraine's critical infrastructure. Water and power supplies were knocked out in major cities by Russian strikes on Monday morning. According to Ukraine, 80% of people in Kyiv have been left without water. Over the weekend, Russia announced that it would suspend a UN-brokered grain deal that has seen over 9 million tons of grain exported from Ukraine during the war, and this threatens to once again limit global food supplies. And finally, North Korea launched 2 short-range ballistic missiles last Friday, its first ballistic missile launches in 2 weeks, as the NPR warned that if the North were to use nuclear weapons, it will, quote, result in the end of that regime, unquote. Lauren, please tell us what is up next on Early Warning.
This week on Early Warning, Angela Kellett sat down with Scott Roecker, the Vice President for the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Materials Security Program. They discussed Russia's unsubstantiated allegation that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb and whether it's a false flag operation.
And then I talked with Jessica Sleight and John Wolfstahl, both at Global Zero. We discussed the nuclear posture review and what it all means for nuclear policy going forward. So please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Russia is accusing Ukraine of preparing to use a dirty bomb, a conventional weapon laced with nuclear materials. President Zelensky has dismissed this allegation, saying that only Russia is capable of using nuclear weapons in Europe. While there is no nuclear explosion with a dirty bomb, there is a risk of radiation exposure once detonated. It is important to note that a weapon of this nature has never been used before. The West has strongly refuted Russia's accusation, one they made without any evidence, calling it a pretext Moscow has created for escalating the war. If there is an effort on the part of Moscow to attempt to launch its own false flag operation in Ukraine, this raises concerns that Russia will further intensify its brutal attacks against civilian infrastructure. This remains in line with the primary purpose of a dirty bomb, which is to inflict psychological damage on civilians. So, what does this mean for further nuclear escalation in Ukraine? To help us understand the situation, today we are joined by Scott Roecker, the Vice President of the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Materials Security Program. Scott, thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
So, what are dirty bombs and what are their intended purposes?
Yeah, so a dirty bomb is a more common term for what is otherwise known as a radiation dispersal device. And that's a pretty good description of the effects of a dirty bomb, a weapon that uses conventional explosives to spread radioactive material. A dirty bomb can be a relatively crude device, as simple as pairing a radioactive source with a conventional explosive. And maybe another way to think about it, there are weapons of mass destruction, a term many people are familiar with, like a nuclear weapon that produces a chain reaction and generates enormous blast, heat, and radiation effects. Then there are also weapons of mass disruption, like a dirty bomb. That is because a dirty bomb wouldn't cause immediate deaths from radiation. Instead, if there were an attack with a particularly dangerous radioactive source, there could be significant social and economic disruption from public panic, decontamination costs, and denial of access for extended periods to the area where the detonation took place. Several studies conducted by Sandia National Laboratories approximately 5 years ago found that the cost of cleanup for a dirty bomb could be in the billions. That's right, that was a B, billions of dollars. For example, there was a relatively minor release of radiation at a hospital in Seattle that cost more than $150 million to clean up. As you mentioned, there is a powerful psychological element associated with dirty bombs. Generally speaking, the public does not understand the effects of radiation, and the US government has done a poor job communicating associated risks. If one were to be detonated, there would likely be a lot of fear and panic from those in the vicinity of the explosion and beyond. There could be longer-term health impacts for those contaminated by the radiation as well. And that's why their use is usually associated with a terrorist act, not by a state in the context of a military conflict. That's what makes this accusation all the more puzzling.
So, is this a false flag operation? And if so, in what ways do you think Russia will use this to further escalate in Ukraine?
Yeah, it's really hard to understand what Russia's goal is with making this accusation. There is really no credible reason for Ukraine to use a dirty bomb on its own territory. There are no military gains that can be realized through dirty bomb use. It won't turn the tide of the war one way or the other. Russia's made the claim that Ukraine would do this and then blame Russia for it. And in at least one version of the story, say that Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon. And I think it's really important to unpack this point, as it's completely false. Nobody would confuse a dirty bomb with a tactical nuclear weapon. First, the destruction from a tactical nuclear weapon would be much wider than that of a dirty bomb. For example, if it was detonated in a city, you would find destroyed buildings in the way that you wouldn't with a dirty bomb. Second, the radiation that would spread from the explosion would look different. A dirty bomb would spread a single radioactive element across an area, such as cobalt-60 or cesium-137, whatever radioactive source that was used in the dirty bomb. A tactical nuclear weapon would spread a combination of radioactive elements, and experts would be able to identify those and determine what type of weapon was used. On this point, it would be difficult to know in advance if a dirty bomb was about to be detonated, as it would look like a conventional weapon, and there would be no unique characteristics that could be spotted before it's used. The most likely reason Russia is talking about a dirty bomb is to create confusion and fear as part of a misinformation campaign associated with the war in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for giving that context. So last question. If Russia is lying about this, which we suspect they are since there is no presented evidence, what other misinformation tactics, like you mentioned, have been used in the war, and who's their target audience?
Yeah, we've seen wide use of misinformation in the lead up to the invasion and ever since. This has been true in the nuclear space related to what has actually been happening on the ground around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as Chernobyl. And I should say that it's been happening on both sides of the war. There have been some on the Ukrainian side that have been spreading false information, but not to the same scale or extent as Russia. There's an excellent piece written by Jacob Eccles in the NTI Atomic Pulse on the dangers of disinformation against Ukrainian biological facilities. In that piece, he notes that the playbook can be broken down into 7 distinct areas: distort, deceive, deny, deflect, dismiss, divide, and distract. We are seeing the same in the nuclear space, and given how effective it can be, I think it's here to stay. We need to build partnerships and recruit allies in order to work against misinformation. And on this note, we're generally lucky in the nuclear space to have such a trusted ally, the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Director General of that organization, Rafael Grossi, has been working tirelessly to gain access to nuclear facilities in Ukraine to try and achieve some sense of stability during this military conflict. After months of negotiations, he led a team to Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in August, which is literally on the front lines of the war, to assess the damage and provide assistance. As a result of this visit, there is now a permanent mission of 4 very brave IAEA experts at the site, where they focus on the safety, security, and safeguards of the facility. In addition, they are providing updates several times a week on the situation at the site, which has been an excellent source of real-time information on what's actually happening there. In a world that is more interconnected than ever, where people primarily get their information from the internet, it's all the more important to have trusted sources of information to understand what's really happening. You are doing this at Plowshares through this podcast and other outreach materials, and I know many people really appreciate your efforts.
Thank you so much for that. Unfortunately, we're out of time today. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Last week, the Biden administration released its long-awaited Nuclear Posture Review, better known as the NPR. As listeners know, a nuclear posture review is the U.S. government's primary public statement on nuclear weapons policy. NPRs have been produced since 1994 by each administration. Biden's NPR was actually released back in March, but in classified form, and then the public version was delayed for 7 months. The timing is notable. The Biden administration released its public NPR last week in the middle of a war involving nuclear threats and 2 weeks before the midterm elections. Presidents don't tend to make major changes to nuclear policy at such times, and this case is no exception. Not surprisingly, this NPR focuses heavily on Russia and China. Russia, as we know, is using its nuclear arsenal to keep the West out of Ukraine, and China appears to be expanding its nuclear forces. The NPR states that by the 2030s, the United States will, for the first time in its history, face 2 major nuclear powers as potential adversaries. It is also notable what is not in this NPR. Despite promises on the campaign trail, President Biden chose not to change U.S. declaratory policy. Biden left the option open for the United States to use the bomb first, just as President Putin is threatening to do in Ukraine. To dig deeper into all this, today we are joined by Jessica Sleight, Partner for Strategy, Policy, and Partnerships, and John Wolfstahl, a Senior Advisor, both at Global Zero. Jessica and John, great to have you.
Thanks for having
Thanks
us.
so much.
Before we get into the substance, let's talk timing. Why, in your view, did the administration wait 7 months to release the public NPR, and why do it 2 weeks before the elections?
Well, thanks so much for having us on, Tom. I think the timing of the NPR is really indicative of just how much the international security landscape has changed, just from earlier this year until where we are now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, using Russia's nuclear arsenal as a shield to commit violence and to invade a country. I think that really changed the calculus of how the Biden administration saw its NPR and saw its national security strategy. You know, the Biden administration really wanted to kind of package all of their national security and national defense strategy into kind of one bigger package to talk about things like integrated deterrence, which we can get into later, but really show how everything is kind of connected. And I think what happened in March when Russia invaded Ukraine, it kind of said, well, we need to go back to some of that national security strategy and, update it, basically. And I think with the delay on the public side of things, we're in a tricky situation where anything on nuclear weapons is going to be seen as some sort of signal by Russia, by China. And I think timing is everything, especially when we're talking about public timing. I think doing it 2 weeks in front of the midterms is actually going to bury it in the US public discourse. But I think it was a time where the administration was just saying, we do have to get this out. We can't keep delaying it and keep delaying it. So that was the decision that was made.
John, any thoughts on this? If I can ask you, do you know the classified version was issued in March? Presumably, it didn't really change between then and now. Is that right?
I haven't looked, or I don't have access to the classified, but I think the timing really just shows how unimportant these documents are. They're a bureaucratic product. Nobody, not Vladimir Putin, not Xi Jinping, is waiting to see how the United States views nuclear weapons or its defense strategy, hoping that the NDS and the NPR will come out. There was a debate whether they should release the nuclear posture review during the NPT review conference. There was a debate whether they should release it before or after the members of states party meeting for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In the end, they found a hook to release it during the Carnegie Non-Proliferation Conference because there just happened to be a non-proliferation conference and they had to get it out. But the reality is this language and this view was pretty much set before the invasion of Ukraine. They then had to update it to make sure that the document wasn't dead on arrival through the invasion, but the mindset of ready to take on both Russia and China, with China as the pacing threat and Russia as the acute threat, was set many, many months ago.
Thanks for that. And that's a good segue into the next question, which is, Jessica and John, give me your initial takeaways. What are your thoughts on it?
So I think the top line for me was overall, it was disappointing, but not surprising. I think even before the whole situation in Russia over Ukraine, I think it was going to be a difficult security environment, a difficult domestic conversation for the administration to really be able to put anything forward that was different, that was in Biden's stated intentions to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in US national security. I think that the previous administration and the previous NPR was more aggressive. It was calling for new capabilities. It was calling for low-yield nuclear weapons. And while Biden's NPR, there is a tone shift that is a necessary tone shift in saying, our goal is to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. Our goal is to move to a sole purpose policy. And we need to make sure we are doing this in lockstep with our allies and our partners. I think that, the Biden administration was just up against so much when it comes to entrenched nuclear views at the Pentagon. And when it comes to this security environment that we're seeing that is just ripe for people who have those entrenched views about needing to fight and win a nuclear war. They are using China's expanded nuclear arsenal. They are using Russia's aggression to call for policies that are going to just increase the danger and increase the risk of nuclear use. I think the Biden administration really missed an opportunity to take a leading role to say, we understand the international security environment, and we know that we can take steps to reduce the risk of nuclear use. And the fact that the danger of nuclear weapons use is so tangible and kind of in your face right now shows that we cannot keep going in the direction that we are going. The overall tone of the NPR was more reserved. We were kind of going back to the Obama administration language, but the policies themselves didn't change. The policies themselves were not looked at in a let's dig into our assumptions. Let's dig into this deterrence and these plans that we've had in the past and see what actually will make us safe. What actually are the requirements for our nuclear deterrent? And that didn't happen. It was this, seesaw between this is what I want to do. I would like to reduce the role of nuclear weapons. And this is what the nuclear establishment is going to let me do, which is not really change very much.
I mean, I agree with everything Jess has just said. I think the tone that I used to describe this to a friend the other day was the Trump administration's NPR was, don't move or we will nuke you. And the Biden administration tone is, we don't really want to nuke you, but we will if we have to, and don't doubt that we can. And so I think there is a little bit more reluctance, but at the same time, in every instance where the United States had an opportunity to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, which the NPR says is a key objective, or to reduce capabilities that we don't need, they side with the nuclear status quo establishment, which is, well, let's hold on to this stuff and let's find a way to use it. And the best example for this is the Trump administration said we desperately need to have a smaller, more usable warhead on our submarines, the W-76-2, so that we can strike deep into the heart of Russia. And the Biden campaign said that's dangerous and expensive and unnecessary. And the Biden administration says in the NPR, the W-76-2 is a really good weapon to show China that they can't get away with small, limited nuclear attacks against us or our allies. This will show them how serious we are. And the reality is that once the Pentagon has a capability, it's loath to get rid of it. It'll always find some way to justify it, even when it's not necessary.
Now, the NPR comes at a time when we're facing the possible use of nuclear weapons by Russia. In some people's view, the highest risk of nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Does the NPR respond to that danger, in your view? And if not, why?
I think this is, again, where we're seeing that intentions versus what was actually possible when the Pentagon actually sat down and wrote the NPR. I think it adequately points out the danger, but we are still maintaining policies, postures, force operations that contribute to the unacceptably high risk that a nuclear weapon will be used by accident or miscalculation. One of the most amusing, if I can say amusing, parts of the nuclear posture review was the language around our intercontinental ballistic missiles and presidential launch authority and keeping those ICBMs on hair trigger alert. And I'm going to say hair trigger alert. It was like the drafters were tripping over themselves to try to say, you shouldn't worry about our posture and the launch process because, it's fine. There are backup systems in place or there are checks along the way. And it really was just misconstruing what the realities are for our launch decision process. The president has sole authority to make a decision over whether or not we use nuclear weapons. And we still have a posture where our nuclear weapons can be launched within minutes of receiving an order. If that is not hair trigger, what is hair trigger? And I know that the military has very specific definitions for different things, but we have to call a spade, because if we don't, we're just glossing over the real risks that are inherent in our policies. And we have to stop doing that. So I think the Biden administration could have done a lot more to respond to the US role in perpetuating some of these risks.
The NPR states that by the 2030s, the United States will face two major nuclear powers. What do you make of this? I mean, we face threats from Russia and China now. So what is new here?
Well, I think the NPR really focuses in on Russia as a threat, but also on China and their reportedly expanding nuclear arsenal. Talking about by 2030, China will have 1,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, we can compare it to what the US and Russia have, which is many times more than 1,000 nuclear weapons. And so I think that any kind of excuse we can have to put fear in people's mind to say, look at what our adversaries or our potential adversaries are doing, and we need to have more options. So I think when we're talking about having to face two major nuclear powers as potential adversaries, we're really talking about just this more dangerous world. And I think what isn't acknowledged in the NPR is that by maintaining these decisions to plan around fighting and winning a nuclear war, we are maintaining a global security system that nuclear weapons have a very central role in. And so if we are not making actual tangible steps to reduce the role of nuclear weapons with other nuclear armed countries, we had many opportunities to do so in the past. Right now, those opportunities are not quite present just yet, but things can change quickly and those opportunities can open back up, and we need to be ready to capitalize on those opportunities. But I think year after year, continuing with our reliance on nuclear deterrence as such a central component to international security and not digging into the root causes for that and not digging into what actually will make us safer, not just the US, but our allies and really the world safer. I think we create the space for other countries to say, well, this is the way the world works right now. And so, for China, we're going to increase our nuclear arsenal because this is how we see power and this is how we see power on the international stage. And so I think that, Tom, you pointed out, we already are dealing with both Russia and China as nuclear armed powers. And we can't let the reported expanding of China's arsenal, we can't let Russia's aggression pull us into some dangerous policies that could really just see a resurgence of an arms race.
I mean, as we're saying, there doesn't appear to be that much new here other than China's arsenal appears to be expanding. But what impact might this have on U.S. policy, right? I mean, it seems pretty clear that the Biden administration is not going to increase the overall nuclear arsenal above New START limits. So what is the sort of practical implication of this finding?
I don't know that the document is meant to lay out the solution, but I think it's a reflection of the genuine challenge the US government is facing. It doesn't know how to deal with this world where it's not just Russia, but it's China that is considered a near peer competitor of the United States on the nuclear realm. And this is a larger problem for the US-China relations broadly defined. Conventionally, nuclear, economic, right? I mean, the US government is trying to figure out how we manage to compete and confront a China which is trying to change the international rules, is engaged in activities that I think any reasonable person would describe as at best worrisome and at worst threatening. And so I think it's trying to put the international system and the international community and the US community on notice that, look, we have a growing problem here. We don't know how to address it. We know nuclear weapons, from our point of view, need to be part of that, but we don't want to go in this direction. We'd like to find some way to engage. And there is genuine frustration in the US government that they have reached out at every possible level, including from President Biden to Xi, to engage on strategic stability, and they've gotten nowhere. Where I find real frustration is if you read the document, you would imagine the United States just sort of turned a corner one day and said, oh, gee, China is building all these nuclear weapons. That's a real problem, without recognizing that we are part of that dynamic. China is building a large number of nuclear weapons because they worry our capabilities will prevent them from having a secure second strike deterrent against us. They are also building up their capability so that we cannot coerce them or dictate terms to them in a military conflict. In essence, they are taking a page out of the US nuclear weapons strategy from the 1960s and 70s. And then we're shocked that they would, in fact, follow such a dangerous playbook. The reality is that the United States is in this mess in part because of our own actions, and we don't know how to get out of it. And the concern, of course, is that at a certain point, the United States will determine that to deter and, if necessary, defeat China and Russia, we will need many more nuclear weapons than we have, and that somebody will make the argument, as quietly they already are, that to have a deterrent that manages both, we need to take the total arsenals in Russia and China and add them together and have that many nuclear weapons. And that is the world that I think a number of people are worried about. It's a world that a number of people in the US strategic nuclear community are hinting at. And it's one where we will find ourselves, quite frankly, in a world with many, many thousands of more nuclear weapons than we have today.
Now let's shift to this issue that was very prominent during the presidential campaign, where at that point, presidential hopeful Biden talked about sole purpose, endorsing that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons should be to deter their use by others, and then gets into the White House and the NPR rejects that. What happened here? What happened to that issue as Biden went from presidential aspirant to sitting in the White House?
I think, like a lot of other things, Biden ran into the nuclear status quo hardliners that usually are the ones that are drafting the nuclear posture review and kind of handing it to Biden to say, what do you think? We did hear from Deputy Assistant Secretary Richard Johnson, who ran the NPR process, that Biden was presented with no first use and sole purpose and decided now was not the time. I think it really is a difficult space and a difficult time to be talking about sole purpose and no first use with our allies. And I think the previous administration really did a disservice to our relationships with our allies. And so part of what the Biden team seems to have to do is rebuild those relationships and rebuild credibility, rebuild assurance. And I just don't think that in those conversations, we were at a place where we were able to say, this is actually how this is going to make you, our allies, safer. We can actually say that we will not use nuclear weapons first. We will not threaten to use nuclear weapons first. That is a responsible way to posture your nuclear weapons when there are nuclear weapons in the world. I don't think when you have Russia waging a war next to you that you are ready to hear anything that seems like it will be a step back from one of your most important allies and partners. And so I think the US has work to do to reestablish those relationships with allies. I think actually the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, has done a lot to bolster our relationship with NATO. But the Biden administration has a task to do, and that task is to show how declaratory policy, how maintaining the option to use nuclear weapons first furthers the high risk of nuclear use. And also is a message to Russia, to other nuclear armed states, that this is actually okay. It is okay to maintain a policy that lets you threaten to use nuclear weapons first. We have to make sure that we are saying that is unacceptable. But by maintaining the option ourselves, there's no way that we have any credibility to say that.
We talked about whether the NPR responds to the current moment and specifically whether it adequately responds to the Ukraine situation and Russia's nuclear threats. But what do you both think at this point the Biden administration should be doing, should have promoted in this NPR that it did not? What is missing here? What should we be asking the president to do?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that we can ask Biden to do. I think for one thing, the nuclear posture review process, the drafting process, needs to be more transparent. There are many steps that the Biden administration can do to respond to the current nuclear crisis. I think that the Biden administration is actually doing a pretty good job practicing nuclear restraint when it comes to Russian threats and nuclear saber rattling. Biden and NATO have done really great not to play into that. But I think that when it comes to US nuclear policy, one thing is to have more transparency into the conversations that were had around US nuclear policy. The NPR itself lacks some details over why certain steps weren't taken or what these steps that will be taken to actually reduce the role of nuclear weapons in US security policy. We have the goal for sole purpose. The NPR has set out a goal to move to sole purpose, to work with our allies to identify steps to move to sole purpose. But when are those conversations happening? Are those conversations happening now? Those conversations should be happening now. And I think that, it's not just Biden who has to be doing something on this. I think Congress has to take a role in saying, okay, you gave us the nuclear posture review, you gave us the nuclear policy. we have some questions. Why did we not move to sole purpose? Why are we not de-alerting our nuclear force? Why does the president still have sole authority over nuclear launch decisions? Why are we holding on to intercontinental ballistic missiles that are vulnerable and don't seem to be adding to our deterrent? I think opening up the process and challenging our assumptions is really going to be important moving forward.
I think the document really misses an opportunity to shape the global landscape. We're very reactive. We're almost in a nuclear crouch. When the document says that we want to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, we want to reduce the saliency, it doesn't say how it's going to do that. I can't point to, other than stopping one of the two new unnecessary nuclear programs the Trump administration put forward, I can't really see anything where the US is exercising leadership to make the world less safe for nuclear weapons. And I think by doing that, we're basically making it easier for Russia and China to pursue a much more nuclear focused and much more assertive nuclear policy. What I would like to see the United States do, because we are the world's conventional superpower, is making it harder for Russia to threaten early nuclear use, making it harder for China to engage in an unexplained and rapid nuclear buildup. And instead, I think we provide a blueprint for how to go about doing that and for those countries to escape greater scrutiny. I believe the document is right when it says that we have a very high bar to nuclear use, that we would only use them in the most extreme circumstances. But to the general public and to the international landscape, our nuclear policy looks a whole lot like Russia and China's, and Russia and China benefit from that narrative. And it's one that I think shows where the NPR was so down in the weeds and so down in the details that it forgot what the narrative is. And the narrative should be the United States wants to make the world unsafe for nuclear weapons. We don't need them, and we can protect our allies without them. The only threat out there that can require us to use nuclear weapons is the threat of nuclear use. And while the document says that, it then spends a lot of time saying, well, we're going to use them in this circumstance, or we might use them in that circumstance, even to the point of saying that we reserve the right to use nuclear weapons should we find ourselves in a near simultaneous conflict with two nuclear armed states. Basically saying if we're in conventional war with Russia and China, we might nuke both. And I think that makes it easier for Russia and China to get away with their, quite frankly, dangerous behavior and behavior that undermines our security and that of our allies.
Jessica and John, there's a lot to unpack here. We could be talking about this all day, but unfortunately our time is up. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best in your work going forward.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.